And one of the factors that disposes me in that vein is the language that is used of placing the body in the tomb, rather than language of throwing the body, as is often found in narratives in the Old Testament when criminals or others are given dishonorable burial. The language used is not respectful. It's, he cast him into a pit and covered him with stones, or he threw the body into a ditch or something of that sort. Whereas in Joseph's case, you have this careful laying of the body in the tomb, and it doesn't look at all like it's a dishonorable burial. This looks like he's taking special care. And indeed, the fact that only Jesus is mentioned and not the two thieves that were crucified with Jesus also inclines me to think that Joseph is singling Jesus out for some sort of special attention, because the other two, the two thieves, were probably dispatched as summarily, but Joseph begged from Pilate the body of Jesus and then treats it with special respect. I would also say that the evidence that McCain gives for dishonorable burial is not convincing, because, for example, not being laid in the family tomb, that's hardly convincing evidence, because Jesus died in Jerusalem. So there wasn't a family tomb there, so of course he wouldn't be laid in the family tomb. This would be a case that anybody who was traveling abroad or traveling far from home and died would encounter, not being laid in the family tomb. So I would suggest, if anybody's interested in this, pursue the article, look at the two and weigh them against each other and make up your own mind. But I agree with what you said, that ultimately either perspective is possible for someone who thinks that this is a historically credible account of how Jesus' corpse was disposed of.
Thank you very much.
Yes?
I was wondering about what evidence is there to this pre-Markian Passion text? Rather than just looking at the style of the writing, how it indicates it, is there any other evidence pointing towards it?
Well, I think the main thing would be what I said in my talk, namely that it stands out from the rest of the gospel material as a large chunk of material that is coherent and continuous, whereas the rest of the gospels are like little anecdotes, sort of little self-contained units telling a story about Jesus or saying that he had, and you don't have this sort of narrative description. So the primary evidence, I think, that Mark is working with a source here would be the literary nature of it, that you've got this large chunk of material that is very different than the rest of the Gospels. Now, of course, one could argue for the historicity of this material specifically in different ways, and I've tried to do that with regard to the burial. But in terms of determining a source, that would be the main way that scholars would judge this to have been something that's distinct from the rest of the Gospel.
Hello, hi.
Hello.
Just had a question on fact to number 5, that the earliest Jewish allegations that the disciples had stolen the body. But isn't that, I mean, surely it doesn't come directly from those Jewish people, but it's written in the Gospel. Right. So couldn't you argue that perhaps that was made up to make it more credible?
Well, I don't think so. The question is that how do we know that the earliest Jewish opponents of Christianity were in fact spreading this rumor the disciples came by night and stole his body while the guard was asleep? I think that you can construct a kind of tradition history behind Matthew's story. The earliest proclamation of the resurrection was, "He is risen from the dead." Now, what response would that elicit from the Jewish opponents of Christianity? In response to that, they would say, well, no, his disciples stole the body. And then what would be the counter explanation to that by the disciples? No, there was a guard at the tomb. And then what would be the counter explanation to that by the Jewish opponents? Oh, the guard fell asleep. And then the final Christian response would be in Matthew's gospel. And so what you have, I think, behind the controversy in Matthew is this lengthy tradition history of response and counter-response. It would be pointless for the Jews to make up the story of the guard falling asleep unless the Christians had first said, well, there was the guard at the tomb. And the Christians wouldn't need to make up the story of the guard unless the Jewish leadership was accusing the disciples of having stolen the body. So you see this assertion and counter-assertion tradition history behind it. Also, the story is filled with non-Matthean vocabulary. Some of the vocabulary is unique words in the whole New Testament to this, which again indicates Matthew's working with prior tradition. And also when Matthew makes this comment, this rumor has been spread among Jews to this day, that shows that Matthew is constrained to refute this widespread Jewish counter-explanation of the resurrection. Matthew's not making this up. He is exercised by the fact that this is a widely circulating rumor, and he wants to quash it by telling the story of the guard at the tomb and it's falling asleep. So for all of these reasons, I don't think we can see the Jewish claim the disciples stole the body as a Christian creation. The guard at the tomb could be a Christian creation designed to answer the Jewish allegation, but I don't think that the allegation the disciples stole the body would itself be a Christian creation. It is something that represents the ongoing polemic and interaction between Jews and Christians, I think, prior to Matthew.
How do we know that the disciples weren't lying?
How do we know what?
That the disciples weren't lying.
Oh, well, I think we would know that on the basis of a number of reasons. One reason would be the one that Peter mentioned in the introduction. Lies produce cowards, not heroes. I like the way you put that. Lots of people have died for a falsehood, but they thought it was the truth. This theory would suggest that the disciples conspired about the resurrection and then lied about it, and then were willing to go to horrible deaths for it. And I think that's just outlandish. Nobody who reads the pages of the New Testament can doubt that these people sincerely believed the truth of what they proclaimed and were willing to die for. So for that reason alone, no contemporary scholar thinks that you can explain the resurrection as just a bald-faced lie. The only place you would find this would be on the internet or from former propaganda from behind the Iron Curtain, but I don't know of any scholar that would hold to this. One other problem would be that it's anachronistic. It looks at the disciples' situation through the rear-view mirror of Christian history and says, oh, well, they would invent the resurrection, they would lie about it. But when you put yourself in the footsteps of a first-century Palestinian Jew, then, as I explained, the resurrection of Jesus is the last thing a Jewish person would think of when confronted with the crucifixion of Jesus. It's totally anachronistic. N.T. Wright has put it very well. He says, for a first-century Jew confronted with with Jesus' crucifixion, you basically had two choices. Either you went home or you got yourself a new Messiah. But he says nowhere in the literature, the first century before Jesus to the first century after Jesus, do we find any of these crucified Messiah's followers saying, well, he was risen from the dead and he is the Messiah after all. What happened in the case of the disciples is unique. So I think the conspiracy theory is rightly dead, and it's not going to be resuscitated. Yes?
If Jesus really did rise from the dead, why did he then ascend into heaven so soon after? Why didn't he reveal himself to more people, preach himself?
Do you mean, why doesn't he reveal himself to more people today?
Why did he ascend into heaven and not die normally? Why did he send his disciples out to preach to people, not himself?
I think it's important to understand the purpose of the resurrection appearances in the New Testament. These were not intended to prove to the public that Jesus was risen from the dead. Otherwise he could have appeared to Pilate, he could have appeared to Caiaphas, he could have appeared to the Sanhedrin. That wasn't the purpose. These appearances were not for the purpose of convincing the public that he was risen from the dead. It was for the purpose of commissioning the 12 disciples for the task of world evangelization and world mission. If he could commission and send out these men, then this message would eventually fill the whole world, and people would come freely into the kingdom of God and into a knowledge of Christ. So the purpose of the appearances was primarily for the purpose of commissioning these men for the task of world mission. And certainly as we look back now on Christian history, we can see the wisdom of that plan, because Christianity has now filled the entire globe. There's scarcely a culture or nation untouched by the Christian gospel 20 centuries after Jesus' death. And so this strategy for human history seems to have been a wise one.
Does the resurrection of Jesus necessarily imply he was God?
Good question. That's a nice question. No, not in a direct sense. And I was careful in how I worded this. We don't say, Jesus rose from the dead, therefore he's God. That would be an unjustified inference. Rather, what I said is that Jesus made certain blasphemous claims that arrogated to himself divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in the place of God himself. Specifically, he claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, the unique Son of God in a way that set him apart from any other human being, and the Son of Man, which is a divine human figure prophesied in the 7th chapter of the Old Testament book of Daniel, who would come before God, the Ancient of Days, and to whom all authority and dominion would be given so that all peoples should worship and serve him. And Jesus identified himself with this Son of Man figure prophesied by Daniel. And that's what got him crucified. So if God has raised this man from the dead, he has vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. It shows that those claims were in fact true. And so this would be a sort of indirect vindication of Jesus' identity as Messiah, Son of God, and Son of Man. And so that would be the way in which I would see the theological significance of the resurrection and the inference to his deity.